The end of 1936 saw a heavy snowfall in London, Ontario. Christmas was unusually warm, and the mild streak continued into the new year. Ice on the Thames River broke up early, causing minor flooding in January. But by April, the flood scares were over, and Londoners were looking towards a pleasant spring. The frost was almost out of the ground, and the snow and ice had disappeared. And then, it started to rain.
WEAF, New York.
The Jell-O program, starring Jack Benny, with Mary Livingston, Phil Harris, Kenny Baker, and yours truly, Don Wilson.
Since midnight Saturday, a mixture of snow and rain had been falling on the 76,000 people who lived in London. Many were sitting down to dinner. Others were tuned to the radio. Most were getting ready for another Monday. This is the story of 4 London neighborhoods that only had one thing in common. They were all near the Thames River. Aubrey Federley owned one of the newest and most beautiful homes in North London. The Bell Telephone executive had custom-built his house a year earlier. It featured inlaid hardwood floors, 2 all-marble bathrooms, 3 fireplaces, and a cedar-lined attic. Since the early 1930s, a series of luxury homes had sprung up along Richmond Street, as London's well-to-do took advantage of the area's low tax rate. The wealthy settled in next door to working-class families who had lived in the area for 2 decades.
Everybody had the same allowance. You know, it didn't matter who you were, you got 25 cents a week, and that was about it. There was never any, I don't think, any distinction about money to any degree.
I had two dogs, one an English setter and the other a Cocker Spaniel. I used to love to take these dogs over to the field to try to train them to be good hunters. That's Mayfair Drive now, which was just a straight open field. Between Mayfair Drive and Bernard Avenue was a mill race.
Bruffdale had been built around a bend in the river. Years earlier, a channel had been cut through it to power a nearby mill. Although the mill was gone, this mill race remained, isolating the top part of the neighborhood on a triangle of land. Federley's home was at the northern tip of this triangle, on ground that had once been the bank of the river. Because the house was so new, the earth around the foundation hadn't settled, making it vulnerable to water erosion.
I remember when I was a kid, waking up in the morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, the machine guns would be going off right outside the front of the house.
The noise of machine guns was music to Captain John Thomas Gore. After a disastrous career as a farmer, the World War I veteran had moved his family to London, where he became the caretaker of the Cove's rifle ranges. A few yards away, developers were trying to sell Springbank Drive as London's newest suburb. Thanks in part to the noise from Captain Gore's rifle range, construction had fallen off. The area remained an odd mixture of brick houses, factories, and wetlands.
If it was a wet summer, we used to have water down at the end. The boys would build rafts and go in and around on these rafts. It was a great place to grow up.
The Army had put a bunch of bullets in one of the coves, the first coves, and some of the kids were diving in there, getting these bullets out and lighting a fire by a tree, and stand behind the tree and put the bullet in there, and it would go off with a bang and a whistle, you know, way somewhere.
We used to have a school picnic every year in Springbank Park, where all the schools in the City of London would go down to Springbank on the same day, have races and games, and then go over to the amusement park. There was a little train in Springbank Park. Everybody had to ride the little train.
The Coves was named after a former bend in the river that circled the neighborhood. Over the years, water flow through the area had declined, creating a swampy area. No one expected it would ever become an active part of the river again.
I remember the days before the flood, when the river was rising, people saying, "We haven't had a flood for 50 years. There's not going to be another flood. We've seen water across the road there before, but it usually just goes away." Well, it was quite a nice neighborhood. Everybody was very proud of their homes. They all had gardens. They all had flower beds, and it was just a nice area to live in.
Jim and Jeanette Butson had moved to 108 Front Street in 1934. He was a retired carpenter, fireman, machinist, and farmer. She continued to work to supplement her husband's meager government pension. Both planned on spending their retirement next door to their only living daughter.
Grandma worked at Parkwood Hospital, when it was on Grand Ave. And then Lapwich Butcher Shop used to be over in Ottaway Ave at that time. It's So Street now. And Grandpa used to walk in. They had the dogs and the cat, the dog and cats they had. And they never fed them raw meat. Grandpa would go up to Lapwich's and buy hamburger and put it home and cook it. Never got raw meat, never.
We used to go to different neighbors' homes on Saturday nights, and the adults would play cards, the kids would get together and be in one room and play games, and then there was always the lunch and all the desserts afterwards. So we were allowed to have coffee once in a while.
Front Street had been built in the middle of an industrial area. Nearby companies included McClary Steel, the London Soap Company, the Beatty Brothers Foundry, and SF Lorison, maker of ammonia and cleaning powders. Most of their waste products ended up in the river.
McClary's used to dump the scrap metal over the bank in the river. And some of it got washed down past what we call the islands. Well, in the middle of this bend in the river, it was deep, and there was a big boulder in the center of it, So we used to go and jump off the boulder. Well, I was hooked onto a piece of scrap galvanized metal and slit my leg open.
Front Street was also on a floodplain. Ice from the Thames washed up in backyards every spring, and basements were frequently flooded. The city had allowed a breakwater at the end of the street to deteriorate, while landfill from across the river had increased the strength of the current. Of the 50 homes on Front Street, the Butsons was the closest to the river.
Now, once again, let me present that Southern gentleman, Kay Kaiser.
Thank you very much, Mel. Some time ago on these programs...
I have a natural fear of water because I can't swim. And that was caused by a childhood incident. So that, you know, I never felt that I wanted to be in the water, but I always wanted to be beside it.
Betty Callow had moved to 9 Napier Street with her family after emigrating from the Isle of Man a year earlier. The first few months had been rough on the family, but that spring, James Callow found a job as a carpenter for the city. He immediately purchased a new radio.
My mother loved it. She said it was the only place she'd ever lived that really reminded her of home. And of course, there was the attraction of the water, and we had a nice garden and an apple tree in the backyard, and you could just walk over the hill and you were right down at the river.
West London was created by the river. The only way residents could enter and leave was by one of 4 bridges. The area had suffered from a disastrous flood in 1883 when a freak cloudburst caused the Thames to jump its banks, drowning 17 people. Over the years, a series of breakwaters had been built. They had protected London West for over half a century and had sparked a building boom. These breakwaters also reduced the river's ability to store water during a severe flood. But that hadn't been a problem for years.
For about a week before it actually happened, I can remember going up with flashlights at night. Quite exciting because we're getting reports of how high the Thames was up along the breakwater. I can still see that looking down with a flashlight and seeing the river rushing by. Normally it'd be about 20 feet down, and here it was about 2 feet below the lip of the breakwater.
There were 3 children in the Callow family, the same number of children that had drowned on Napier Street in 1883.
This is just when they had thought everything was coming around, you know, wonderful, and my father was happy in his work, and, you know, we were all healthy, and it looked like everything was going off wonderfully well. That's life, isn't it? You can never tell.
We are signing off now, the time being a half minute past the half hour past 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, to return to the air at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Until that time, good night and good morning.
It didn't rain, it poured for 2 straight weeks. Just poured. Yeah, just poured. I've never seen it rain so hard in my life. Oh my God, it was just damn. The wipers wouldn't take it off the windshield. You're just looking through rain all the time. Yeah, 2 straight weeks, night and day. That's Steiger, boy, I'll tell you. Oh, geez.
Over 4 inches of rain had fallen over the weekend. Another 2 inches was on its way. The heavy rainfall should have been soaked up by farms upstream, but the fields were saturated. There was almost total runoff into the Thames.
All that water had to get to the river. So here were the farmers tilling their land, getting the water to the ditches, and that was just the same as pulling a plug in the bathtub.
At City Hall, regular business was put on hold to deal with the flood danger. Off-duty firemen were called back. Police officers were given extra shifts. PUC employees were taken off their regular jobs and told to start sandbagging in West London. Bricks were thrown around bridges to strengthen their supports. The river was 6 feet from the top of the breakwater.
The first sign I had that anything was likely to be serious was the morning I rode my bike to school. I was going to Central Collegiate, across Blackfriars Bridge and up the hill, and the river had been high for the past 2 or 3 days, but that particular day, I think it had been snowing a little bit in the morning. Certainly there had been snow, wet snow coming down, and the river was very high. We'd been looking at it probably for more than a day, but I remember thinking it was awfully close to the bridge as I went over.
Paramount is on the air.
Like Kingsley Ferguson, the rest of London was having a regular day.
Sparkling eyes, smiling lips, dancing feet. This is your moment on the air.
Several miles north of London, the Avon River broke over its dam, flooding roadways and homes in Stratford and backing up storm sewers. The Avon joined the Thames River outside of St. Mary's. Their combined flows covered the main street in 3 feet of water.
Rinso presents the heart-stirring romance of a loyal woman, Big Sister, starring Alice Frost and Martin Gable, and brought to you by the new Richard Rinso.
To the east of London, the Thames washed out rail lines in Woodstock, snarling train traffic. The river roared west through Ingersoll, taking out the town's main bridge and derailing a CN flyer, killing 3 men. Both of these branches were heading towards London, ready to converge in the middle of the city.
At noon, I got a hold of my fiancée, and I said, let's go over to London West and see what the problem is. And as we went down the Dundas Street hill in front of Labatt Park, as it is now, the manhole covers were being pushed up, and water was gushing up from the manhole covers, which meant that already the level of the river was higher than the main streets in London West.
The north branch of the river was rising by a foot each hour. By noon, it was 4 feet from the top of the embankment. West Londoners began to take notice. As dumps along the river flooded out, rats began to flee to higher ground. They quickly overran nearby residential areas. In South London, Elsie Leyland had watched as the park across from her home flooded out. She sent her oldest son, Ken, to the end of the street to keep an eye on the river level.
But eventually the water came over the embankment just this side, that would be the south side of the King Street Bridge, and then flooded in onto Thames Street at the north end of Thames Street. And when this happened, the water began, it would come up the street, like it would surge slightly, maybe a half an inch high, a little small surge, and then it would roll back half the distance, then it would surge forward again. And it sort of marched up the street this way.
In Bruffdale, water was cutting through the mill race and working its way into people's backyards. Fearing the worst, Fred Keim had asked his wife to call him at work if there was any trouble.
About 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, she called me to say that she thought I should get home. The river was starting to overflow the bank. So I proceeded to go home, and sure enough, it was just starting over the bank. And almost before I could get out of my car, there was a quantity of water, just like a broken dam, came over the bank and down our driveway and stranded me and my car in the driveway.
The river overran its banks at the northern tip of Bruffdale. The Thames began flowing around the Federley House, piling boxes and haystacks from farms upstream around it. A few blocks south, traffic was backing up. The bridge leading out of the city had been closed because of the river level. Helen Allison was returning to her job at the university from lunch. She decided to solve the problem.
We went to the driver of a Greyhound bus and asked him if he wanted to get out of this. And he said, "Is there a way?" And we said, "Of course there's a way." So we said, "Follow us." So we took them up University Avenue and took it right across the front of University College, you see, and then out the back way to the Sarnia Gravel.
University President Sherwood Fox wasn't happy to see the campus roads used for ordinary traffic. His frustration turned to concern when he discovered that lower sections of the campus were threatened.
Colonel Brown was the executive secretary of the university, and like all Army men, he retreated to a good, safe distance away and phoned back his orders. I answered the telephone and I was told to evacuate the university. And I said, "I can't evacuate the university. I don't have the power or the staff." So he said, "Well, where's Dr. Neville?" who was my boss. And I said, the last time I saw him, he was up at the top of the university tower looking over the situation.
I was in what was then called manual training, industrial arts, I suppose it would be now. We took it, I think, once or twice a week, dreadful class, taught by an absolute psychopath that used to throw chisels at kids. And anyway, we got a reprieve because in the middle of this nightmare, the principal of Empress School, a very nice chap by the name of Reg Fowler, he very quietly said that they'd had a report that the Thames River was now coming over its banks, and we would all be dismissed early and head home, straight to your homes. Well, that would in one ear and out the other, because we made a race for the nearest bridge, which was Blackfriars Bridge, and we must have spent a good half hour there watching the water just about 3 feet below us.
There was everything coming down the river. The Chesterfields, chairs, and chicken coops, all kinds of chicken coops, and chickens, and a dog on a raft. I don't think we'll ever forget just what that looked like. And I don't think as children we saw the danger. It was just fascinating thing. Where did all these chickens come from?
We should have been kept in school so that our parents knew where we were, you know, because Empress School had 2 floors. Even if the water had gone that high, you know, there would still been, we could have still been saved from the school. But they let us all out, and they didn't seem to think anything of it. So, of course, I was going home, and I'm going down Warncliffe Road toward Charles Street, and the water was shooting up out of the sewers like fountains. And as I got a little further along, the water was covering from one sidewalk to the other, and I don't know whether I was crying or not, but I was trying to get across the road, and a man came and picked me up and carried me across the sidewalk, set me down, and told me, hurry home, go straight home.
The city's chief engineer, Colonel Veach, urged people to stay put. He told frightened West Londoners that there was no danger of water breaking through the sandbags near Blackfriars Bridge. Many residents didn't believe him and began to evacuate.
My mother was standing out in the front of the house just about berserk. She didn't know where I was or where my brother was. And I still didn't know what the panic was because it was quite dry. I went into the house and looked out the back window, and here was the Thames River, which was about, I guess, behind our house to the east. It would have been maybe 300-400 yards. And here it was barreling up right through our garden.
A few blocks south, water was spilling onto the sidewalks. Wilf Klopp and his brother began moving their inventory onto the counters of their hardware store.
Nobody ever talked about a flood there. Never heard of it until it happened. And even then, we weren't too sure what size flood it was going to be, because I was out frolicking in the middle of Warncliffe and Dundas having my picture taken in 18 inches of water. So.
Neighbors had been watching the east end of Front Street all morning, expecting early signs of a flood to show there. The Thames River surprised them.
About 1:30, I noticed the water over the banking coming in from the Wellington Street Bridge. I wakened my husband because he'd been working at night. He'd sleeping, and he got up, and we got the car out of the laneway, and there were so many people on the street with cars, we had to ask them to move so we could get our car out. And as we drove the car onto the street, the sewer gave way, and there was a huge hole by the side of the house.
The street went down like that and up again, so it started to fill in at the center of the street. So by that time, it got too deep that you couldn't even get the cars out.
When it got higher, we started to sort of pile things up in the house. We figured, well, it might get over the floors. And Dad piled everything up that he could. And then when it got up to the front steps, it was up several steps. We went across to the fire department, had rowboats down there, and we went across to my grandmother's place up on the hill.
My mother was washing dishes, and she had her wedding ring on. The fireman had quite a struggle to get her out of the house because she didn't think there was any danger. So they picked her up bodily and took her out of the house. She did not have even her wedding ring on. She was just in what all Mother and Dad had was what they had on.
Walking out of Front Street was no longer possible. Volunteers and rowboats were busy rescuing stragglers.
I hate the word rescue. Do you know another word for it? Moved one family to dry land. I was very surprised at what they considered to be precious possessions. A canary, beat up ukulele. The strangest things suddenly became valuable possessions.
The coves had been protected from the early stages of the flood by a railway embankment. But water had slowly seeped into the old river bend from a break near a train trestle. The coves was on the verge of spilling into the neighborhood that surrounded it. Police and firemen began to evacuate the area. Catherine Windsor watched as a truck driver entering the area was stopped at a roadblock.
Well, he was a heavy-set man, and he was a big man, and he was burly. And when he came down, when he went to come through, you see, I don't know whether it was a fireman or a policeman said, "Hey, Mac, you can't go in there." And he just turned, he said, "Like hell I can't. My baby's in there, and I'm going." So that's just exactly what he did, and he just roared that truck down about 4 more doors and plucked his kitty out of there.
Nora Reynolds' uncle was sent to evacuate her grandmother, but Louisa Russell refused to leave her pets.
We had 2 dogs, and she wanted to take the dogs, and there were several canaries there too. And he said, "I'm not going to take all those things in the car." And then finally he said, well, oh, well, go ahead, bring them, or something like that. Well, he was in the laneway, and he said, I'll meet you at the front. And he backed out of the laneway. By the time he got around to the front, as I say, the water was up to the wheels.
Captain Gore had left home early that day to help out in West London. It never occurred to him that his own home might be in danger.
Ray was kind of watching around for some reason. That's the youngest brother. He ran out there and said, and looked and saw the water coming up, and he said, Mom, it's getting worse, it's getting worse. And she never thought much about it, you know, because he's so young. And so he said this 3 times. Finally, she went and looked, and she got an awful shock.
Something must have broke over there or east of London, and then it just came through there, you know, like a gush. And that's what swept her just like that.
A wall of water between 15 to 30 feet high tumbled into the area. A young mother only had time to grab her child and some baby clothes. An 8-year-old girl fled with her birthday cake. The Gore family was forced to abandon their house and crawl onto an earth mound in the backyard.
The reason that she went out the back of the house and left the house and stood on this mound of dirt was because she was scared that the boiler was going to blow up, because all the gush of the water smashed the door wide open. It was a big door and went tearing down on the basement. And she thought it was going to blow up. That's why she wouldn't go back in the house. The maid at that time was really going crazy. Mother is very solid. She never moved at all in these things. Kept her head.
I was in the basement just finalizing the stuff coming out of the basement. My brother was looking after placing it up on higher levels on the main floor, and the water started coming in around the basement window. I was there when the window broke, and she come in like Niagara Falls. Of course, I got out of there quick. We left the store at 20 after 2, and I was carrying the cash register, and my brother carried 3 guns, shotguns, and some shells. He probably had an idea that somebody would be trying to take advantage of the flood and steal stuff, and he was going to protect his property.
At Blackfriars Bridge, the river was washing away sandbags faster than they could be set up. In desperation, Colonel Veatch ordered his men to dump truckloads of sand onto the street. The water was less than 3 feet from the top of the breakwater. Water was hitting the houses on Front Street with such force it twisted off gas and water connections. Trees were toppled. Sidewalk cement was heaved off. Huge craters were gouged into the earth. Butson's house was taking the full impact of the current.
The water was so strong that it just, the pressure just lifted the house away. And everybody was in shock at that point, because the Butsons had not taken anything out, at all out. Their dog was left in the house because everybody figured, well, it's not going to come that high.
When it went off, it went through and took Dad's garage with it. Took my brother's whole Ford car. We found it halfway down the street, buried in sand. But I guess the house went down, and when it hit the button, the center button of the Wellington Street Bridge, it kind of smashed up. So there was nothing left out of just the foundation. Grandpa never got upset. He was quite calm, man. He thought it out. See, there it is. It's gone. There's nothing you can do about it. Maybe they kept it inside themselves for a while. I don't know.
At Bruffdale, the river was still rising. Although the university was never evacuated, students were sent home early from classes.
So we walked down, and the water was obviously raised a great deal at the bridge. And when we got down on Richmond Street, the water was coming right up just north of the university entrance. There was several men and a dog out in a boat in the middle of the street. And there was a chap carrying his dog out of the house, and it was obviously a very serious situation.
They were actually rowing across hedges along Bernard Avenue. And they had we had fortunately built our house up rather high and terraced it around it. So they rode up to almost to the top of the terrace and took my wife and our two dogs and proceeded to leave me there because they were going to pick up some older citizens along Bernard Avenue, which they did.
The river had reclaimed its old course, and Aubrey Federley's home was in its path. The current that had torn away Butson's frame cottage was now ripping away the earth from the mansion's foundation. Federley had a heart attack and had to be taken to the hospital in a fire truck. An ambulance couldn't get through the water.
We took the bus home from South Collegiate, and the route came down York Street and going over that bridge to Stanley Street. The water was almost up to the roadbed, and then we became very serious. Like before, we were saying, oh, we might not get home from school, and thought it was kind of like a joke. When we got off the bus at Wharncliffe Road and started down Springbank Drive, we got to the top of the hill, and we could see in front of us just this grayness. All where there should be a whole bunch of houses in a road, there was just this grayness. And so I'm standing at the edge of this water, looking at a car with 6 inches of the roof sticking out of the water and wondering whose car it was, and I knew the car very well because it's my uncle's car.
Like Reynolds, Don Gore returned from school to find his home flooded and his family stranded. 2 of his teenaged friends offered to help out.
I was standing there and Ken Black came along, and he said, Don, we're making a canoe. We're building this thing, and it's not done yet, but we think that it's waterproof.
And so Keith and I went back and got the canoe on a baby buggy frame and took it down there and pulled it down by rope. He pushed and steered it, and I got down there and we put it in the water, got in, got the paddles going.
The water was just coming in there. It's like you filling a basin, you know, from one side. It was just tearing in there.
And it took about, I would say, maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes to get down there.
They were coming sideways. And they were getting over too far where the fence posts were. And I thought, I kept hollering, just go back out. So they would come back out again. I said, if you hit those fence posts, it'll tear the bottom out. Well, nobody could swim.
They all behaved pretty good in the canoe. Got them all back, including the dog, too. He was behaved, too.
Ken Black was playing hooky that afternoon. When his principal found out, he suspended punishment. Shortly before 5 o'clock, the river in West London was a few inches from the top of the breakwater. Kingsley Ferguson was riding his bike home from school.
I had heard nothing. I thought it would be the same river that I'd left. And it really was. When I got to Blackfriars Bridge, everything looked rather deserted. I knew then that the river was extremely high, but it didn't seem all that much higher than the morning. And Blackfriars Bridge was dry, as I remember it. I went across. Blackfriars Street was dry. I went down the 2 blocks past Wilson to Albion, turned left on Albion Street. All dry. The street was deserted. And I thought I'd find out my family at home. But the door was locked. There was no sign of life. There were no people around. And after making sure there was nobody there, I got back on my bike.
At the same time, Albert Flood was driving his cab into the area to pick up a fare.
Red Davis, he was ahead of me. He went over ahead of me. We get in there, we get at the water. He was a bit deaf, and I didn't realize it, eh? He put old Red, I hollered at him, I said, hey, pull the throttle out in that old car. I think he had a Graham, no Graham. And he says, hey? Couldn't hear.
Over on Edith Street, Norma Welch's father was returning from work.
When Dad got home, they thought there's no big problem. There was no water around the house, you know, so they decided to cook supper. And Ruth Fraley came running up the road saying, "The bank has broken, everybody get out now." So they started throwing the dog, the cat, the kittens, the canary, the coats, everything in the car. And they just got up around Mount Pleasant Hill when the water was coming in the bottom of the doors of the car. So they just got out.
At 5 p.m., the river overran the breakwater near Blackfriars Bridge. A second break soon appeared near Dundas Street. Within the hour, the Thames River would be flowing across its entire length. Kingsley Ferguson was riding right into it.
I started noticing the water coming up from Dundas Street, and it got high enough that I couldn't see the curbs any longer. I didn't know where the curbs were, and I took a chance on bumping down and bumping up again, but I missed the bump up and blew out both tires. The full force of both branches of the river where they meet at Dundas Bridge was coming across into the park. So by the time I got just below the bridge on my way out, I guess I was in trouble.
The old car was just idling over, right? And of course it just sucked the water right up the tailpipe, right into the muffler. Goodbye. She went clunk, bing, bang, and that was the end of that. Yep. So I pushed them out of there. We got run at that Dundas Street Bridge, well, the Kennington Bridge it was then. Cease French is standing. He's a cop. Good guy, too, he was. Oh, he's waving his arms like a maniac. He's standing there, he's hollering, "Go back, go back." Yeah, do you think we're going back in that water? Gee, no way.
Police had closed off the Dundas Bridge because it was shifting from the force of the current. Despite the danger, flood refugees made their way across. It was the only way out of West London.
I don't know whether they were firemen or just people standing around, came down to meet me and dragged me through the rest of the water back up the bridge, and then gave me hell for having gone into that area. And I said, he said, "Didn't you see the guards on the bridge?" And I said, "There were no guards on the bridge, not Blackfriars Bridge." Apparently they left that out of their calculations.
Edith Callow and her 3 children had evacuated their home early and had gone to stay at a friend's house in South London.
And meanwhile, my father couldn't find us, and nobody could tell him what had happened to us. Anyhow, the police were there, and they wouldn't let anybody into the area. So my father gave a famous old English oath and dashed to the policeman and caught a boat and went over to the house.
Many of the people were on the roofs of their houses. Here they were sitting up on the roof, hollering for help, or some of them were firing shotguns to attract attention. I rode up Warncliffe Road to just about Mount Pleasant, and here was somebody else waving out of an upstairs window. The entrance was wide enough for me to roll into the vestibule of the home and tie the boat to a banister, and they walked down from upstairs, walked down the steps, got into the boat without getting their feet wet.
Cease French, who had failed to stop Albert Flood from crossing the Dundas Bridge, entered West London to help rescue anyone and anything he could.
They were in a boat, and they saw this dog in the window. And it was by Will Klopp's store there. And it was thrashing around in the window. So they decided they'd just ram it and get the dog out, which they did.
Boy Scouts were called in to assist exhausted police officers by directing traffic and warding off looters. London's mayor drove the homeless to emergency shelters. An employee from Labatt's Brewery left his job early to help out in West London. During one rescue attempt, he stepped out of his boat into what he thought was a shallow patch of water. He fell right into an open manhole.
And the hip waders filled immediately with water and pulled him down. And I remember at the age of 13, as I was at that time, being quite horrified to hear that his body had been found at the foot of the steps of the house next door to us that we moved into shortly after the flood. It had washed from the field a distance maybe of 300 yards and ended up there. So that brought up one of the tragedies fairly close to home in my impressionable mind, age 13.
Joseph Britton was 37. He left behind a wife and 4 children. Refugees began to pour into evacuation centers. Public schools that had sent children home a few hours earlier now took in their entire families.
They looked glassy-eyed and just staring, you know, and you go like this in front of their eyes, and they wouldn't even blink. They just stood there, and the children, the ones I really felt sorry for were the children, because they didn't know what the heck was happening to them.
The river peaked at 23 feet above its regular level at 3 in the morning, the highest level ever recorded. The remainder of the flood flowed southwest, wrenching homes in Kilworth off their foundations, washing out 2/3 of Thamesville, and threatening Chatham's main bridge before the river emptied into Lake St. Clair. Less than 24 hours after it started, the flood of 1937 was over.
And you couldn't see Tecumseh Park. Couldn't even see the stands. The fences, where were they? 10 feet underwater. It was buried, just buried.
Over 5,000 Londoners were homeless. Property damage was in the millions. The city's water supply was cut to 1/3 of its normal capacity. Industries shut down. Drinking water had to be boiled. Electricity was limited in West and South London. Main traffic arteries were cut off. The city's telephone system was jammed with nearly twice the normal volume of calls. Refugees continued to fill churches, schools, and military facilities.
They were mostly pathetic. You know, they had lost everything, a lot of them. It's hard for anybody to realize just how bad this flood was.
We all had to get shots for typhoid. My mother nearly died. I think I was the only one in the family that managed to get all the shots, because everybody was so ill, you know, with the shots. And of course, I think a lot of people were in shock.
3 days after the flood, the weather turned warm. Londoners began returning to what remained of their neighborhoods. The damage was so widespread, it was impossible to tell what part of the city had suffered the most. Almost no one had flood insurance.
An awful mess. Terrible mess. All the furniture, people's furniture was put outside. London West never looked so bad. It looked terrible.
The water came in so fast in the house that it lifted the gas stove enough to get the linoleum off the kitchen floor and shoot it up against the wall. And there it was, stuck in the mud on the wall when we got home. And the frying pan off the stove was in on the bed in the downstairs bedroom.
And of course, the one thing was you couldn't buy supplies to clean. Every hardware store in the area was all out of cleaning supplies, brushes, mops, anything like that. And I mean, some people were just going around, you know, kind of begging pails, and, you know, 2 or 3 neighbors using the one pail or the one brush because they didn't have anything else to work with. That part was really trying.
The water had subsided, of course, except the basements were all full. So I went down with my father, and we had rubber boots on. Must have been 3 feet of water in the basement. And I had previously been looking upstairs for the cat. Toddles couldn't find it anywhere in the upstairs of the house. Didn't know how it could have gotten out because the doors were all locked and the windows were all locked. Took a step forward, following my father over to one side of him, and squashed this awful feeling as my foot went down, and air bubbles came up. And I said, "Dad, I think I found poor old Toddles." So each time I put my head under the muddy water and brought up, it was one of my footballs.
And it's sad because you can see what the house, what the possessions, what everything looks like, but just ruined, like not like a fire that's burnt up and destroyed, but just sort of ruined.
One lady came in tears to my dad to see what he could do about it, and he said, "Not a thing. Put it out in the yard and turn the hose on it, and that's the best you can do." Then you have to pray that we're going to have enough sunshine to dry it out, you know.
Well, it looked perfectly lovely. The living room was set up as if Mrs. Federley was going to have tea. The Chesterfield was there, and the chairs, and the coffee table. But anyway, it looked simply lovely. It just looked like a picture, except that there was no walls.
And it was like an old-fashioned doll's house, where the whole front is a door, and you pull the door open like this, and you see the upstairs and the downstairs, and it's all there, all furnished. That's exactly like the Federley house. The whole front was clean gone. And the dining room table was, the tablecloth was still on it, just breeze, just a little wafting in the breeze. I just couldn't believe it.
Well, it's hard to describe how you feel when your mother and dad has lost everything and you've lost everything that you worked for, because our house was a mess. There wasn't a thing in it any good. Really, there wasn't.
Said he gave Mother and Dad $15 to fix the house, which maybe in that day seemed like a lot, but it was nothing, really nothing to repair the damage that was done.
We salvaged a lot of things and washed them and put them in the kitchen, of course, and the very next day we came, they'd all disappeared. Someone had stolen them.
Well, there was nothing much left to loot at my place. It was standing, all the brick was all off the front and off one side, nothing there but the framework. Great big gully underneath where you could see right into the furnace pipes was gone, and the water pipes and all the things that was there.
The only bright spot for most Londoners occurred in early May, when the Rotary Club organized a benefit concert for flood victims. The demand for tickets was so great, a second show had to be scheduled.
When we went in, we all got settled down, and they let us in way ahead of time, and we're sitting there, and all of a sudden, there's Guy Lombardo, the curtain goes up, and he's playing Home Sweet Home. Why did they cry? Here's our homeboy, Guy Lombardo, coming home and playing Home Sweet Home for us. For all the flood people. I mean, we were sentimental, I guess, to think he'd do such a thing. London really wasn't that great to him, you know. I mean, we just took him as a matter of course.
Property values in West London plummeted. It was said you could buy a home for $500. One woman said she would sell for $25. Families who had lost everything had to abandon hopes of retirement. Many husbands and fathers literally worked until they died.
We were down and out again. My mother was, bless her soul, was a hard worker, so was my dad. But they'd been wiped out in the Depression, and they just got to London to start again when they got wiped out in the flood. So my mother had a theory. If you buy one thing and pay it off, then buy the next thing and pay it off. They can never take anything but one thing away from you.
No level of government wanted to take responsibility for flood relief. West London families argued for months just to get their property taxes reduced. The provincial government of Mitchell Hepburn conducted a survey of the area's flood controls. and then did nothing. Time was on Hepburn's side. Over the years, West Londoners lost interest in flood control. They convinced themselves that 1937 had been a fluke. Many families stayed in their old neighborhood.
Nobody really wanted to move out. It seemed so unlikely we'd have another flood. We'd heard there was one in 1883, I think, and you know that's a long time ago, and it'll probably be a long time before it happens again.
But in 1947, the Thames River topped the breakwater, forcing another evacuation in West London. At a special meeting of City Council, it became obvious that the only solution was to build a dam north of the city. This time, the politicians had no choice. In 1953, Fanshawe Dam was opened. A few months later, West London property taxes went up to help pay for it. The new dam also eliminated flooding dangers in the coves. Captain Gore, who apologized to his wife for not being able to save her, stayed on to see the area become a thriving residential community. He also lived to see a trailer park and a paint factory go up next door to his rifle ranges. Although Fred Kimes' house was only slightly damaged, he lobbied for river improvements. Unlike other areas of London, Broughdale got them. The Thames was dredged, a dike was constructed, and the old mill race was filled in. Aubrey Federley vowed that the river would never harm his home again. He rebuilt his house on top of a concrete bunker, reinforced with steel beams. In the 1950s, many of his neighbors' homes were torn down to make way for new apartment buildings. Rather than sell the property to developers, Federley's widow slashed the price by several $1,000s so a young family could buy it. The Federley house still stands today. Front Street never recovered from the flood. Many of the remaining residents moved their houses to new lots at their own expense. Over time, other homeowners moved away and renters moved in. Front Street was becoming a slum.
As far as the press was concerned, Front Street didn't exist. London West was more important. There was maybe more houses over there. London North they were interested in. But we always wondered, was it because we were poor people that it really didn't matter? Because we heard as much as anybody else did.
Jim and Jeanette Butson stayed in their old neighborhood to the end. Their son-in-law cashed in his life insurance policy and bought his family a new home. He gave the Butsons his old house. The couple celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary there, and their 60th. Jim Butson died in 1958. Jeanette sold the house to the city 5 years later. In 1975, a real estate agent took this photo of what remained of Front Street. Within 5 years, the last houses were torn down and the land was turned into a park.
You know, there's a lot of memories down there. You go down there now, you look down the street. I walk down and try to picture where the house was. And I go down and say, well, so-and-so lived here, so-and-so lived there, so-and-so lived there. And so, you know, they're all gone now, but no, we had a good life down there.
But all of this was in London's future during the spring of 1937. On May the 12th, the city held a parade to celebrate the coronation of King George. Refugees were still living in churches. Many areas were without streetlights. Unemployed men were being put to work rebuilding the breakwater. Sightseers were clogging city streets. And in West London, Max Ferguson was still looking for his cat.
He was missing for a week, and we suddenly heard meows. This was the week after we'd been back in the house, and we had to knock out upstairs a huge hole. My father took a sledgehammer and smashed in, broke the whole wall, and there was the cat. Came out emaciated, but it rallied and survived.